12,000 Romans faced more than 100,000 Armenians and won in a single afternoon. Ancient writers even claimed only 5 Romans died. Exaggeration or not, the staggering gap in losses makes the Battle of Tigranocerta one of Rome's strangest victories. On paper, it looked insane. 1 legion against an empire. King Tigranes the Great commanded armored cavalry, volleys of archers, and endless infantry. Lucullus had barely 13,000 men. By all logic, Rome should have been crushed. Instead, Lucullus spotted a weakness and turned it into one of the boldest wins in Roman history. Welcome to Heroic History, your daily history channel where we share incredible stories of ancient warfare. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss more epic battles like this one. Because what happened at Tigranocerta didn't just decide one fight, it reshaped the way military strategy would be understood for centuries. Let's find out. Everything began in 69 BC, right in the middle of the Third Mithridatic War. This was the last and most decisive of 3 major clashes between Rome and Mithridates VI of Pontus, the king who ruled along the southern coast of the Black Sea. Mithridates had spent decades trying to carve out an empire at Rome's expense. He fought them in Greece, in Asia Minor, and even launched naval campaigns across the Aegean. He was feared not only for his military skill, but also for his brutality. In 88 BC, he ordered what Roman sources call the Asiatic Vespers, the mass killing of as many as 80,000 Roman and Italian settlers across Asia Minor. That massacre burned his name into Roman memory as one of their greatest enemies. After suffering defeat after defeat at the hands of Roman commanders like Sulla and later Lucullus, Mithridates had few safe havens left. By 69 BC, with Roman pressure closing in, he fled north and east, crossing into Armenia. There he found refuge with his son-in-law, Tigranes II, the great king of Armenia. Tigranes wasn't just any monarch. He was one of the most powerful rulers of the Eastern world at the time. Under his reign, Armenia expanded into a true empire, stretching from the shores of the Black Sea down to the Mediterranean coast of Syria and even threatening parts of Mesopotamia. Ancient writers describe him as a man of immense pride, wealth, and ambition. He even took the title King of Kings, the same lofty style once used by Persian emperors to make clear he was not just a local king, but a sovereign over other kings. As part of his vision, Tigranes built a brand new capital, Tigranocerta. This city, located in what is now southeastern Turkey, was meant to shine as a monument to his glory. He filled it with palaces, theaters, markets, and walls that were still under construction by the time the Romans arrived. To populate his new capital, Tigranes forcibly resettled tens of thousands of people from conquered regions, uprooting whole communities from places like Cappadocia, Cilicia, and Mesopotamia. The result was a city impressive on the surface, but one with divided loyalties inside its walls. Lucullus knew this new capital was Tigranes' personal project, the symbol of his power. If it fell, Tigranes would lose face not just with Rome, but with his own subjects and vassals. That pressure worked in Rome's favor. When Lucullus sent a demand that Tigranes surrender Mithridates, the Armenian king was outraged. To hand over his father-in-law would not only insult his honor, but also undermine his claim as an equal to Rome. He flatly refused. Instead of waiting for reinforcements or building up a larger supply base, Lucullus then made one of the boldest moves of the entire war. He led his army straight across the Euphrates River and deep into Armenian territory. His force was astonishingly small compared to what he was about to face. Ancient sources differ, but Plutarch describes Lucullus having about 16,000 heavy infantry, veteran legionaries hardened by years of war, plus around 1,000 cavalry and light troops. Other estimates place his total closer to 12,000 to 15,000 Romans, supported by a few thousand local auxiliaries. To put that in perspective, this was just a single Roman army group, nothing like the massive legions that would later march under Caesar or Pompey. Lucullus wasted no time. His legions advanced at a pace that stunned even the locals. Instead of getting bogged down in sieges or waiting for reinforcements, he struck directly into the heart of Armenia, seizing small but strategic towns along the way. Many of them acted as supply depots and relay points for Tigranes' armies. By snapping them up one after another, Lucullus cut off communication lines and forced the Armenian king to respond before he was ready. Tigranes, caught off guard, had been busy dealing with unrest in the western stretches of his empire, especially in places like Syria, where local rulers had begun pushing back against Armenian control. News of Lucullus's advance reached him while he was still trying to stamp out these disturbances. He reacted the only way he knew how, by summoning a massive army. Messengers raced out across Armenia, Cappadocia, Mesopotamia, and beyond. Lords and client kings were ordered to send troops at once. What gathered around Tigranes was one of the largest forces recorded in the ancient world. Ancient writers, especially Plutarch, loved to throw out huge numbers. They tell us Tigranes boasted of 20,000 archers and slingers, 55,000 cavalry, of which 17,000 were heavily armored cataphracts, and 150,000 heavy infantry, plus countless camp followers and support staff. That would bring his force to somewhere around 225,000 men. Modern historians, of course, are skeptical. The logistics of feeding and moving 250,000 soldiers in that region would have been nearly impossible. Most scholars today suggest a more realistic number of 70,000 to 100,000 combat troops. But even the lower estimate would have outnumbered Lucullus, 12,000 to 15,000 by at least 5 to 1. Yet Lucullus believed that numbers weren't everything. What he trusted was the iron discipline of Roman legionaries, their ability to hold formation under pressure, and the speed with which they could move and strike. He gambled that by advancing quickly, striking first, and forcing Tigranes to react on Roman terms, he could overcome what looked like impossible odds. Lucullus, however, moved quickly enough to occupy high ground near Tigranocerta before the Armenian host was fully assembled. From the hills, his legions could strike at the enemy's flank, a tactical advantage that would later prove decisive. Instead of storming the city walls, Lucullus tightened the siege and waited. He knew Tigranes would have no choice but to march his army to relieve the capital. As the siege of Tigranocerta tightened, Lucullus did not rush to storm the walls. Instead, he played a waiting game. He knew Tigranes couldn't let his capital be surrounded for long. The city, though impressive, had unfinished sections, walls still being completed, and many of its inhabitants were not long-time residents. Many had been relocated there from various conquered regions. Their loyalty was never fully assured, and some inside the walls later betrayed the city when the moment came. Moreover, Tigranes was under intense political pressure. In the ancient world, a king's prestige depended heavily on appearing strong, leading from the field, confronting threats head-on, not cowering behind walls. If Tigranes remained inside, it might be seen as cowardice or as losing control, weakening his grip over reluctant provinces or client kings. Also, many of his forces, armored cavalry, large numbers of infantry, were built for open battle. If he could draw Lucullus out, he might exploit his numerical superiority and cavalry weight. Staying inside a fortress would limit mobility, negate charge power, and force a long siege, a scenario where Roman discipline and engineering might give Lucullus the advantage. Eventually, the Armenian king would have to march his endless army straight toward the Roman lines. Lucullus intended to meet him there, not on the city walls, but in open battle, where discipline and tactics could outweigh sheer numbers. By the autumn of 69 BC, both armies were finally facing off. The Roman camp, though tense, was steady, composed of hardened veterans who had served under Lucullus through years of campaigning in Anatolia and Pontus. These soldiers were not simply tough. They were drilled, disciplined, and seasoned by hardship. They'd marched long distances, built fortified camps nightly, kept tight formation in bad weather and under missile fire, stayed loyal even when greatly outnumbered. They carried pila, javelins, to disrupt enemy ranks, then closed with short swords when the battle came down to hand fighting. They trusted Lucullus implicitly. His daring strategy, moving quickly, seizing key towns, using terrain to his advantage, had won them victories before, and they believed it would do so again. Then, finally, Tigranes arrived, not with a modest host, but with what looked like an ocean of men. The ancient sources say the horizon itself seemed alive, miles of infantry, lines of cavalry, archer, and slinger units interspersed, and long baggage trains that extended into the dust behind them. At their center rode the Armenian cataphracts, the shock cavalry that inspired fear across the Eastern world. These cataphracts did not ride lightly. Both horse and rider were clad nearly head to hoof in metal scale armor, the overlapping plates of bronze or iron, sewn to leather backings covering the chest, shoulders, flanks, legs, and in some cases the horse's neck and head as well. The rider wore a helmet, often with just slits for the eyes and maybe a small opening for the nose, only enough to see and breathe. The armor weighed heavily. Some reconstructions suggest that just the armor for a single cataphract, horse plus rider, could run around 40 kilosun or more, depending on how fully protected the horse was. They carried long lances, contus, designed to crash through enemy lines, supported by swords or axes as backup weapons in close quarters. When these men all advanced together, thundering hooves, clinking metal, drawn lances, they formed both a physical wall and a psychological one. To Roman soldiers, seeing those heavily armored horsemen wheel into formation, the sight would have been terrifying, wings of cavalry that seemed nearly invincible. We're talking about more than just looks here. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Appian described Tigranes' host as a sea of men, tens of thousands of armored cavalry alone, shining under the sun like a wall of iron. Now, modern historians point out that those numbers are way too big, but even if we cut them down, we're still talking about several thousand cataphracts, some of the heaviest cavalry in the ancient world. These weren't ordinary horsemen. Both rider and horse were wrapped head to toe in scale armor, the kind of plating that could turn them into living battering rams. When they charged, the impact wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Most armies broke long before that iron wave even hit, and that was just one part of the Armenian host. Behind the cataphracts came endless ranks of infantry, archers, spearmen, slingers, and light troops pulled from every corner of Tigranes' empire. Some were professional soldiers, others little more than levies dragged in from subject peoples, but sheer numbers made up for lack of training. Add in baggage trains, stretching for miles, and clouds of mounted skirmishers riding the flanks, and the Romans were staring at an enemy that could swallow them whole. The mismatch wasn't just big, it was almost mythic. On paper, it looked like a story out of legend, one Roman legion standing against an empire. Even Tigranes' own generals could see the danger in that confidence. They warned him not to risk everything on one pitched battle. Let the Romans rot, they argued. Trap them, starve them, make them break their teeth against the walls of Tigranocerta. A siege would have played to Armenia's numbers and bought time for allies to rally, but Tigranes, proud and hot-tempered, refused. He mocked the very idea of fearing Lucullus. He laughed at the tiny Roman force, saying the famous line, "They were too many to be ambassadors and too few to be an army." To his mind, the question wasn't if he would win, but how fast. That arrogance set the stage. On October 6th, 69 BC, the two armies finally came face to face outside the walls of Tigranocerta. The Armenians deployed on high ground, a commanding position that let their archers and cavalry look down on the enemy. It was exactly the kind of battlefield that should have crushed Rome. At the heart of the Armenian line, right where the ground flattened, Tigranes placed his armored cavalry, the cataphracts, ready to deliver a devastating charge straight through the center. Lucullus saw it immediately. A head-on clash here would be suicide. If his legion stood toe-to-toe and waited for that charge, the sheer weight and momentum of ironclad horses would shatter his line. But Lucullus wasn't just a soldier, he was a strategist. He understood discipline, timing, and the power of deception. Instead of meeting the Armenians where they were strongest, he set a trap. He left Lucius Marina in charge of about 6,000 men, with orders to hold the line and keep the Armenians' eyes fixed forward. Meanwhile, with only 2 cohorts, barely a fraction of his army, Lucullus slipped away. Using the folds of the ground and whatever cover he could find, he led his men on a wide flanking march. Step by step, out of sight, he moved into position, not to meet the cataphracts head-on, but to strike at the very heart of Tigranes' army, where it was weakest. Their objective was a rise of hills behind the Armenian lines. If they could reach that high ground, they'd gain not only a vantage point, but also a clear path down into the enemy's rear. From there, the Roman commander could hit the one part of Tigranes' vast host that was both vital and vulnerable. Tigranes and his officers watched the movement with open contempt. To them, it looked like a retreat. Why else would such a small detachment peel off and march away from the battle? Some laughed, others shook their heads, certain that fear had finally broken the Romans' nerve. The king himself reportedly mocked the maneuver, telling his men that the battle was already won, that victory would come without a sword being drawn. That confidence had reached its peak, but the Romans weren't running. What looked like panic was actually the most dangerous phase of Lucullus's plan. It was a maneuver that demanded razor-sharp timing, quick marching, and extraordinary courage. The soldiers trudged over rocky ground, moving along gullies and slopes to stay hidden from view. They couldn't afford to be seen until the last moment. If the Armenians realized what was happening, they could pivot their massed cavalry and crush the exposed cohort before it ever struck. Finally, the Romans crested the ridge. From the top, Lucullus could look down into the vast Armenian camp sprawled across the plain. What he saw wasn't an army in formation, but the living, breathing chaos that followed every ancient host. Rows of tents, wagons, tethered animals, traders hawking goods, servants carrying supplies, cooks, smiths, and the whole royal baggage train. It was a small city on the move, swollen with non-combatants. In sheer size, it was massive. In terms of fighting strength, it was fragile. That was the real weak point of Tigranes' force. An army of 100,000 needed food, weapons, spare gear, and the countless hands to haul it all. Without that support, the glittering cavalry and endless infantry were just mouths to feed. And here it was, sitting practically undefended with only a thin guard scattered among the crowds. Lucullus turned to his men. His face, by every account, was calm, steady, almost casual. He pointed to the camp below and told them quietly, "This is where we win." He didn't order them to hurl themselves at the armored cataphracts or the main battle line where numbers would crush them. Instead, the plan was simpler and far more devastating. Strike at the enemy's stomach, its nerves, its very sense of order. By attacking the camp, the Romans wouldn't just destroy supplies. They would ignite panic, the sight of flames, the roar of terrified servants and fleeing camp followers, the sudden chaos behind their own lines. These things could tear an army apart faster than any frontal assault. The trap was now fully set. At that moment, the fate of more than 100,000 Armenians hinged on the nerve and discipline of a few thousand Romans, moving swiftly and silently into the most exposed corner of the enemy host. What Tigranes thought was cowardice was, in fact, the prelude to disaster. With a roar echoing through the valley, Lucullus and his men charged down the slope. But their target wasn't the enemy's battle line. It was the royal camp, crowded with servants, traders, and non-combatants. The attack came so suddenly, so brutally, that panic exploded instantly. Camp followers scattered in every direction, desperate to escape the Roman blades. Their only instinct was to flee. But in their chaos, they crashed straight into their own rear lines, smashing into Armenian infantry and even the proud heavy cavalry. Soldiers who expected a fight from the front instead faced terrified civilians stampeding from behind. Confusion turned to full-blown chaos. Officers' orders were drowned out by screams. No one knew what was happening in the rear. From his vantage point, Tigranes watched in horror as his flawless formation unraveled from within. At that moment, Murena, following Lucullus's plan, made his move. Seeing disorder in the enemy ranks, he ordered his legions forward. The Romans advanced with iron discipline, shields locked, pushing relentlessly. Trapped between Murena's assault and the chaos in their rear, Tigranes' infantry began to crumble. Units broke formation, each man trying to save himself. Discipline, the backbone of any army, was gone. All that was left was raw survival instinct. Even the dreaded cataphracts, Tigranes' pride, found themselves stuck in the mess. With no space to maneuver or charge, they became easy targets for the Roman infantry. Lucullus's bold strategy had worked perfectly. He used the sheer size of the Armenian host against itself. The battle turned into a massacre. The disciplined legion showed no mercy as the Armenian army collapsed. Tigranes himself was among the first to flee. Desperate not to be recognized, he threw away his royal crown in the dust and vanished from the field. His escape sealed the fate of his army. With no king to rally them, organized resistance broke down completely. The retreat turned into a rout, and the Romans cut down survivors in a bloody pursuit. Roman writers claimed the scale of the victory was staggering. Over 100,000 Armenians killed on the field, while Rome lost only a handful of men. Some sources even say just 5 legionaries. The numbers are almost certainly propaganda, but they reflect the scale of the mismatch. A small, disciplined army led by a master strategist had crushed a force many times its size. After the battle, Lucullus marched straight to Tigranocerta. With its king and defenders gone, the great city surrendered without resistance. The Romans looted its immense wealth, one of the richest hauls ever taken by a Roman army. Yet Lucullus showed restraint toward the inhabitants, sparing the civilian population even as his soldiers carried off the spoils of victory. He allowed the Greek settlers and other locals to return to their homes, winning over their loyalty. Word of his victory reached Rome, where people were stunned. No one could quite believe that Lucullus had pulled off such an incredible feat. His eastern campaign quickly became the stuff of legend, even though his fame was later overshadowed by generals like Pompey the Great. Still, the Battle of Tigranocerta stands as a textbook example of military brilliance, a masterclass in winning the impossible. Lucullus's victory devastated Tigranes' empire. The king's power and prestige were shattered almost overnight. Many of the kingdoms and peoples Tigranes had conquered seized the chance to break free, rising in rebellion to claim their independence. The Parthians, eternal rivals of both Armenia and Rome, also saw an opening to expand their influence into the suddenly unstable region. Yet for all its drama, Lucullus's campaign was far from finished. Both Mithridates and Tigranes managed to escape, dragging the war on for years. Harsh terrain, supply issues, and the exhaustion of his own troops, worn out after years on campaign, kept Lucullus from pressing his advantage to the fullest. In the end, command in the east was taken from him and handed to Pompey, who would claim the final glory of victory. Lucullus returned to Rome, celebrated in triumph, and then retired from military life. In his later years, he became famous not for battles, but for the lavish banquets he hosted. What made this battle so strange wasn't just the lopsided casualties. It was how it happened. Lucullus didn't win by brute force, he won by nerve and vision. Instead of locking shields against the Armenian host, he turned the battlefield inside out, striking the camp, disrupting the cavalry, and using terrain to undo sheer numbers. In doing so, he showed that a small, disciplined force could make an empire's strength work against itself. This was a lesson generals would not forget. From Caesar at Pharsalus to Belisarius at Dara, commanders who faced impossible odds looked back to battles like Tigranocerta for proof that victory could be wrestled from disaster with the right stroke of genius. And that is why this day in 69 BC stands out even in Rome's long history of victories. It wasn't just a win. It was a reminder that strategy could outweigh numbers and that sometimes the boldest gamble was the safest move of all. Thank you for staying with us through this 30-minute journey. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment. We'd love to know what you think. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and thanks for watching, and we'll see you in tomorrow's video.